philosophy describes two ways for acquiring knowledge: rationalism and empiricism. So, rationalism stresses reason, meaning that we learn through thinking, while on the other hand, empiricism stresses observation, meaning that we learn through our senses. So, let us take a closer look at each of them. Rationalism actually goes all the way back to Plato, who believed in the world of forms, which is, according to him, a higher and more ideal world. And the only way you can connect to this world is through thinking. And then in the modern time, Rene Descartes has been the most influential figure for rationalism. And he used doubt not for the sake of doubt, but in order to reach a starting point, he can build other things on it. So, in other words, he used the doubt as a mental anchor toward certainty. So, when he doubted so many things, he realized that the only thing he can trust is that he is a thinking being. And then from that he proceeded to the point that there must be a supreme being, which is God, who put that thinking into him. And then he kept going until he reached the idea of dualism, which means that the body and the soul are two different entities. They are separate from each other. So that takes us to an important question. Can we learn new things only through thinking? Yes, mathematics, which is the foundation of all sciences. And not just we can learn new things, actually the mathematical outcomes are certain, meaning that we are certain that they are correct. So Immanuel Kant thought that a priori synthetic knowledge is possible by taking mathematics and other things as examples. Of course, the fact that we start by initial information and then we proceed until we reach sure result or sure outcomes mean that the outcomes are somehow embedded in the initial premises we started from. The fact that they are embedded doesn't mean, of course, that these outcomes are useless or even they are clear to us before we do the derivation. Take, for example, this infinite series you have. Is it clear to you that all these infinite terms add up to pi square over 6? If you think so, please tell me. So now we turn to empiricism. Empiricism goes all the way back also to Aristotle, who was the counterpart actually of Plato. Aristotle, on the other hand, believed that we can learn things through observing our world. And it is known about him that he conducted some experiment himself, regardless, of course, of the quality of the outcome, but at least he believed in the concept of doing experimentation. And then John Locke represented the most important figure for acquiring or for promoting empiricism, and he promoted the model of the white paper of our minds, the blank slates, meaning that he believed that there is nothing in our mind other than what senses put into it. Of course, that does not mean John Locke completely ignored the cognitive and the thinking ability. Actually, one of his quotes, he mentioned that you don't own the knowledge you get until you think about it. But it means that he thought the only way of acquiring knowledge is what senses put into our mind. Now, the limitations of the empirical knowledge, because basically based on the fact that they are acquired through our senses, all the limitations our senses have, they will immediately apply to empirical knowledge. So, for example, our senses are limited. We cannot see, for example, very small things. We cannot see very far things. That's why we need a telescope. Also, the zone of the frequencies of visual and audible contents that we see are limited. Some sounds, when they are too high, we consider them ultrasounds and we cannot see them. Also, we can see visual content with the frequencies that we call them the visual spectrum. Other than that, we cannot see. Infrared, we cannot see. Ultraviolet, we cannot see. So all these limitations applies to our senses, which means they immediately apply to empirical knowledge. Not only that, the more important things, our senses are deceiving. Like take for example, when you look at fish in a pond, the fish would look closer to you than what it is in reality. It is an important message, something that tells you your senses are not created to be giving you perfect or even real things of what is going on. You get deceived. Also, sometimes our senses put us under false impression. Like the most famous example is when we feel that the earth is stationary and it is the sun that spins around us. Actually, in reality, now we know that it is the other way around. It is the earth that spins around the sun. So all these things mean you cannot 100% trust what your senses are telling you. There must be some validation and verification of the outcomes of their senses. So Islam is the religion of knowledge, so it must have a lot of things to say about these philosophical views. So let's see what Islam says about that. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in Surah An-Nahl, addressing the time we are born from the wombs of our mother, it is He who brought you forth from the wombs of your mothers, knowing nothing. Pay attention, knowing nothing. It may be reminiscent of what John Locke said, blank slates. So does that mean that Islam promotes the empiricism view of knowledge? Wait, we have to dig a bit further. When we look more, we will find a famous hadith many of us know, that when the Prophet ﷺ says, every newborn is born on the fitrah. So what is this fitrah? The fitrah is also mentioned in another Quranic verse. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, so set your face upright for religion. It is the fitrah of Allah in which He has made men. This is the fitrah of Allah on which that we have been created. And the majority of the scholars have interpreted fitrah in this context as Islam, as the religion of Islam. So if we go back to the hadith, now we can understand what is the meaning that we are born according to the fitrah. Imam al-Cordoba said that we have been created, our hearts are ready, have an aptitude to accept the truth. And he made a nice analogy. He said, this is exactly as our eyes and our ears are ready to see and are ready to hear. Even though when we close our eyes, our eyes still have the ability to hear, to see. So our minds or our hearts, which the hearts here are referring to the minds and the feeling too, our hearts are not like blank slates. Actually, they have a certain structure that make them not neutral actually to the truth, but inclined to it. And that's what Imam al-Nawawi said. He said, every newborn is ready and inclined to accept Islam. And non-Muslim philosophers like Immanuel Kant, the German philosophers, he said some concept, and he mentioned few examples. He mentioned space, time, and numbers. Some concepts are built up in our minds, hardwired in our minds. So our minds are not a blank slate. They have a certain structure in them that make us eligible, qualified to see the truth and get inclined to it. If you understand that, based on the fact our minds have a certain structure, and that structure limit what we can absorb from the huge domain of knowledge, you can actually add one more limit of the human knowledge. In addition to all the things we mentioned about empirical knowledge, all the limitations of our senses, now you can add one more limit, which is that because our minds have a certain structures, we are limited in terms of the type of knowledge we can get. Not every type of knowledge we can absorb or even we can detect or probe. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned that by saying that they ask you about the soul. Say this is one of the things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala kept for himself. And you have been given a little bit of knowledge. Notice the word illa qalila, a little bit of knowledge. That's only what you have been given. And in another verse, the same issue is mentioned when Allah is talking about the jinn. He said that the jinn can see you, but you cannot see them, meaning that their window to knowledge is wider than us. That's why they can see us, but we don't have the ability to see them back. And exactly the same thing applies to angels. Also the malaika, they can see them, we cannot see us. So meaning that the pre-structure that we have been created with, which is the result or referring to the fitra mentioned in the hadith and in the verse, these things limit the type of knowledge you can get and we can absorb. So I don't want to give you or to put you under the impression Islam is 100% supporting the rationalism view. It is not really like that. Islam has its own complete knowledge, a complete theory of knowledge. We want to handle some of these questions, like for example, which is the point I just mentioned, is Islamic epistemology mainly rationalistic? And is there a way that now philosophy described rationalism and empiricism as two different mutually exclusive views? Is there a way that they can be combined and working together under a single framework? People also, and this is a point we didn't touch on in this session too much, but we'll address it more next time inshallah. People also refer at the empirical knowledge as probable, meaning we are not certain about it. It needs more validation, and the validation can only increase your confidence of it, but it cannot make it certain. So is there ever a way the empirical knowledge can move up to the level of certainty? What are the other impedient factors that limit our knowledge? Is it only the limitations of our cognitive abilities? So inshallah, all these points we are going to discuss in the next episode inshallah. And thank you, and waiting to see you next time. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.